Hey folks, today we're going to talk about some decks that I'm excited about in Standard, Historic, and Alchemy after the upcoming Kamigawa Neon Dynasty set releases. We're not going to have any sideboards or mana bases because that takes too long. That's not the exciting part of this. But to start things off, we brewed up this blue-black vehicles list that gets to take advantage of what I think might be a couple of the most powerful cards, at least in a standard power level sense, from the upcoming set. Mukotai Soul Ripper is a vehicle that gets to crew for 2 as a 4/3, and when it attacks, you can sacrifice other artifacts or creatures, only 1 per attack. And if you do, it gets a +1/+1 counter on it permanently and gains menace until end of turn. The menace means that this is pretty hard to block profitably. You could just wind up sacrificing whatever crewed it if you're really looking to just get in damage quickly. But for the most part, as far as 2-drops go, this is just a really highly statted attacker that crews very easily. The creature that you can crew it off of on turn 3, ideally, is an Okiba Raid that you play on turn 1, which drains your opponent for 2 points up until then, and then on turn 3, transforms into a 2/2 with Menace that gives all your other vehicles Menace, meaning they might not even need to sacrifice anything to the Soul Ripper in order to be attacking through a couple of blockers. It seems weird because Okiba Raid is a common, but this is actually probably one of the cards that I'm more interested in out of the set, especially in any vehicle aggro deck. It's a lot of damage for 2 mana, or for 1 mana. A lot of damage off of a 2/2 for 1 mana. But there are a lot of times when you play some kind of Savannah Lions creature where in the late game you top deck it and the board state's kind of stalled out and it's never going to get any points of damage. I actually do kind of like that Reckoner Raid gets in 2 points of not just damage, but drain damage, meaning that you're winning a race more easily at a point where some other 1-drops would just kind of be invalidated. So following that up, we have Reckoner Bankbuster, really going for the Okiba Reckoner sort of flavor here. This is sort of like a combination of an aggressive vehicle with the old 2-drop, whose name escapes me, that you can tap every turn for 2 mana to draw cards over and over. And this kind of just bolsters the number of vehicles we can play on turn 2. It's this and the other side of Kasima alongside the Soul Ripper. And then try to play 3-drops that crew it. Unfortunately, with the current iteration of the deck, that's just Biting Palm Ninja. There's a possibility that the list needs more copies of potentially Graveyard Trespasser could be a good 3-drop that's capable of crewing Bankbuster, or it might be the Bankbuster just isn't the right card to play. I'm sort of the opinion that Kasima's worth it as a 3-drop because having Omen Keel, come on, let me, no? There we go. Having a 2-drop vehicle that attacks plays well with Reckoner Raid because it gets Menace when you actually can attack with it on turn 3, and then you start getting to make land drops, which is kind of a nifty form of card advantage, but might be ultimately that that's not really worth it, and that Kasima should just be some aggressive creature that can crew Bankbuster instead and is kind of just better at pushing through damage on its own. Maybe, maybe not. Additionally, as our final vehicle, we have Mindlink Mech, which pairs well with Sorin, notably. The token that you can follow up with on turn 4. Crews makes Mindlink Mech into a 4/3 lifelinker. Pretty nifty. Otherwise, Tainted Adversary gives it Death Touch, and you can gain Menace if your Biting Palm Ninjas don't have Menace counters on them yet. And then the final thing that I was experimenting with, aside from just the general package of the whole deck being rather aggressive and slightly card advantage-y and then disruptive removal, is the potential synergy between Thieving Skydiver and Biting Palm Ninja. I feel like especially if the metagame ends up picking up a lot of vehicles, then we could end up in a position where, for one, Skydiver can steal blood tokens and get rid of treasure tokens for 1 mana, which isn't the worst thing in the world. But if vehicles are extremely common, then you can have a curve out where you play Thieving Skydiver on turn 2, attack to ninjutsu in Biting Palm Ninja, which lets you Thoughtseize the opponent. And then that sets you up really nicely for Thieving Skydiver on 4 to steal maybe a Soul Ripper that your opponent put creatures into already. Probably not, but maybe a Bank Buster, and then start stealing their card advantage. Probably not something that actually deserves to be main deck, kind of just in the blind, but something that I wanted to highlight as potentially an interesting piece of tech if a lot of these artifacts that cost 2 and 3 mana that are pretty impactful wind up seeing play. Next up, we have the card/combo that I'm probably most excited about, and this particular build of it was set up around Historic with Alrund's Epiphany, or rather, not Historic, was set up around Alchemy with Alrund's Epiphany still being legal. This is technically a Historic legal deck, but probably not worth it compared to playing it in Alchemy where all of the cards are still legal and probably a little stronger. But specifically, this is built around the combo between Hinata Dawn Crowned and Magma Opus. Now, I'm certain that Hinata Dawn Crowned has probably been getting attention in other places, but I've seen it getting an oddly low amount of buzz compared to where I feel like I'm at with this card, which is that it's probably my pick for the strongest card in the set, and probably the most likely to make an impact, and that's largely due to the synergy with Magma Opus, but also due to some other synergies overall. So, to start with, it makes everything your opponent plays that targets cost less. And that doesn't mean stuff that targets permanents, it also means stuff that targets spells. So if Hinata is in play, then your opponent's counterspells cost more, their removal spells cost more, yours cost less. So you can play Hinata, and then if your opponent tries to remove it, immediately Valorous stands for 1 mana, and your opponent had to spend 1 extra mana for their removal spell. Which means that it's kind of hard for them to hold up removal for Hinata, because they have to pay more, in the same sense as Thalia, but also because if they don't, and it gets back to their turn, well, if you do manage to use a Negate or a Valorous Stance to fizzle their removal, it's really hard for them to play a second in the same turn, and if you untap with Hinata, then all of those mana advantages really start to stack up. Essentially, it's kind of like a Thalia that instead of making your stuff more expensive, makes your stuff cheaper, and it's a 4/4 flyer. That's a stat line that actually just really blocks well. But the part that goes absolutely over the top is Magma Opus. Now, Magma Opus has, surprisingly, a lot of ability to target things, because you can deal 4 damage as you choose among any number of targets, which means you can deal 4 damage, or 1 damage to each of 4 targets, and then target 2 permanents to tap. That's 6 targets, means that you can play Magma Opus for 2 with a Hinata in play, provided your opponent has 1 creature in play, or you have a second creature in play. Because you can target your opponent, Hinata, and yourself for damage, and then target 2 of your opponent's lands to tap down, which means worst case scenario, if nobody has any creatures on the board except for Hinata, then you're casting Magma Opus for 3. And in that case, you're doing 2 damage to your opponent, tapping 2 of their lands down, drawing 2 cards, and making a 4/4. That's pretty busted. And it doesn't take a lot of work to play Hinata with 6 mana up. In which case, either worst case scenario, you have to fight a counterspell war over Hinata. Best case scenario, Hinata resolves. There is no way your opponent can stop you from playing Magma Opus at that point. You have priority and just get to do that. In fact, you can wait until your opponent's beginning of turn to tap down their lands when they're untapped. And you're maybe not clearing their board necessarily, because you are limited to doing 1 damage with Magma Opus unless you want to start paying more mana. But regardless of what the rest of the shell looks like, it doesn't take a lot to make a random control deck that just plays random control cards. And here I opted to try to play the Alrund's Epiphany Unexpected Windfall Galvanic Iteration pile that gets you more mana to cast Hinata with Magma Opus sooner. Just kind of seems like Unexpected Windfall is a good way to take that. And then Galvanicing 2-mana Magma Opuses goes over the top real quick. But in general, you can just kind of substitute anything here. This is also a standard viable combo. You can just play Expressive Iterations, Hinatas, Magma Opuses, and Celestices, and then all of these cards are still just totally standard legal. Honestly, the only thing that isn't is Alrund's Epiphany. Without Alrund's Epiphany, maybe it's not worth it to play Galvanic Iteration, but it's probably still worth it to play Windfall, and then you probably just play like more Expressive Iterations and more counterspells, and feels like aggro is going to have a hard time trying to fight Hinata plus Magma Opus to me. It takes a little while to actually kill your opponent, especially if control is just playing a bunch of removal spells. Fading Hope kind of fell off for a while, largely due to the fact that when Alrund's Epiphany got banned in Standard and when Lear got nerfed, it wasn't really worth playing the card disadvantage of Fading Hope. You couldn't really make up for that disadvantage without Lear, and without Alrund's Epiphany being, well, your catch-up card draw. But yeah, that's not the case with Magma Opus. Magma Opus draws a lot of cards. So it could be entirely viable to just play a bunch of Fading Hopes to buy time against aggro and then just play a bunch of counterspells to actually resolve your stuff against control. Control right now is kind of based entirely around tapping out for big 4 and 5 mana mid-range threats, and the reason it couldn't do that before was because Alrund's Epiphany represented a combo that went way over the top of that, and even without Alrund's Epiphany, Hinata and Magma Opus seems to be a combo that goes way over the top of that. So wouldn't be surprised if something like this ends up being more or less what the Tier 1 meta in Standard looks like not too long from now. Next up we have a green-white deck that I admit might be overly metagamed for the current version of Standard where white-black midrange is a prominent deck. Essentially, part of the idea behind the deck is that Yasharn is super good against them. They have very little removal currently that they actually play that gets rid of it. Their Vanishing Verses don't hit it, and the other 2-mana removal that they typically play involves sacrificing a creature in order to be able to cast it, which Yasharn denies. And from there, we have the Storm the Festival, Renin 7, Sika's Chariot, Velar Retreat game plan that has kind of been the core of a lot of green-white mid-range strategies right now that, at least as of late, have been relatively successful going over the top of white-black. What we're adding to that is Kadama of the West Tree, which is a card with Reach, gives modified creatures trample, and whenever a modified creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. Meaning, anything that has a +1/+1 counter on it that does damage to the opponent, Rampant Growths us. And that goes really crazy with Felidar Retreat pretty fast, because Felidar Retreat, with a land drop, can modify every creature on our board. Kadama means all of those creatures have trample, and so every single one of them is antheming the entire team every time it does damage, and if it's not doing that, then it's making more creatures. You can kind of see how this snowballs out of control really fast. The toppings on that are that we have the card Fearless Fledgling, which admittedly may be going a little too deep, but the idea is you play Fearless Fledgling on turn 2, and then on turn 3 you play Kadama of the West Tree. You played a land drop, so your Fearless Fledgling is now a 2/2 with flying and trample that gets to attack. It's kind of hard for your opponent, short of a removal spell, to have a way to stop that from hitting and doing some damage at the very least. They could have a 2/2 of their own, I suppose, but if it's any smaller than that, you have trample. And suddenly that's rampant growthing you on turn 3, so that you untap on turn 4 with 4 lands, meaning you get to play your Felidar Retreat, and then make the land drop, which can now pump Kadama of the West Tree up to a 4/4 that has trample and is modified, so it's connecting for damage to ramp to pump the Felidar Retreat too. And if you major for it land drop, then Fearless Fledgling has flying again, and it's hitting and ramping too. And that curve goes hard pretty quick. In addition to that, we have Immersion Sequence, which, if it's just played normally, can ramp us into one of our mini 4-drops, but also on turn 3 can attack if we have a Kadama of the West Tree in play. Now, a 1/1 might not be the easiest thing in the world to connect with, but if it does, because your opponent just didn't have interaction for whatever reason, then that's ramping you real fast, in addition to just being a mana dork. And in the late game, with Felidar Retreat, having a, well, literal rampant growth means that all of your other creatures have access to being pumped in the late game, so this is less dead than a rampant growth in a normal deck. We also have Catilda, who can start putting counters on all of our creatures if we need to go hard with Kadama, and Tangle Floorhedron to just have more things that ramp into 4-drops. So I'm not entirely sure if white-black midrange will look the same going forward in the future of Standard. It might be that they just happen to start playing more cards that remove Yasharn. The new 3-drop sorcery speed Exile Hero's Downfall that buys back a creature or planeswalker if they have an artifact and enchantment seems like kind of a natural inclusion to that deck as it stands that gives them more outs to Yasharn, but the rest of this deck still offers a lot of pressure in a lot of ways, and they need to have answers for every Yasharn, which this deck can play multiple of post-board, ramp into very quickly, and then storm the festival to find more. There's a real chance that short of a deck that has enough unconditional board wipes to get through a bunch of very large creatures, this deck could just outscale basically anything else. I'm excited to find out if it will. Our next list isn't so much a new deck as a very slight but very impactful twist on an existing one in Historic. Now, Jeskai Control isn't the premier version of Control in Historic. That honor goes to blue-white. But it got one small new card that could potentially make a really big difference in it, which is Mnemonic Sphere. It doesn't look like a lot to begin with, and the big draw is mostly that you can pay 1 mana to cycle it by drawing a card. Not quite cycle, in terms of cycle synergies, but discard it to draw a card. And the reason that's relevant is because it's an artifact, and putting an artifact in the graveyard for Unholy Heat gets you to the point where you can deal 6 damage at some point in the mid-game a lot more realistically. One of the deck-building constraints when playing with Unholy Heat is you don't really want to play a lot of shocks. You need to have a viable game plan for not necessarily how to turn on Unholy Heat on like turn 3 or turn 4, necessarily, but for how you're going to at least have Unholy Heat ever be something that deals 6 damage when you're brewing with it in control. And Mnemonic Sphere goes a long way towards making it so that Unholy Heat can actually kill your opponent's planeswalkers, especially your Dominaria and Control Mirrors, around turn 5 or 6, which means that the opportunity cost of including in your deck early on to be a removal spell against blue-white auras or against random threats out of Phoenix is a lot lower. And additionally, when you're not cycling Mnemonic Sphere, it's not actually a bad card despite what the common rarity might lead you to believe. It's not exactly Behold the Multiverse, because it doesn't scry 2, but splitting a divination up over the course of 2 turns is actually a pretty reasonable way to get to 2 mana, or to get to draw 2 cards, spending only 2 mana at a time, which actually does matter in terms of what you're able to hold up counterspell-wise, especially post-board and Control Mirrors. And, similar to the benefits that Vertel has had in Standard, it actually makes it a lot easier to do things like play Expressive Iteration on turn 3 on the draw in Control Mirrors, because you just have a Mnemonic Sphere that happens to be sitting in play. Otherwise, you have a hard time playing Expressive Iteration and actually getting a 2-for-1 off of it on curve without discarding something to hand size. Mnemonic Sphere is fixing that for us. So, whether Mnemonic Sphere's benefits end up worth being the cost of, at least in this build, I've trimmed some removal and I've trimmed Memory Deluges, the end result is that you are playing more total card draw spells against different control decks, which is an improvement over Memory Deluge. It's hard to resolve a 7-mana Memory Deluge anyway, and Mnemonic Sphere is a lot easier to resolve. But slightly less removal against aggro decks isn't where you want to be in this format, where Jeskai and Blue-White's Control's primary opponents are that the aggressive decks kind of beat them right now. But you get to make up for a little bit of that by playing Unholy Heat and lowering your mana curve to interact more on the early turns before you take damage is one of the best things you can do to improve an aggro matchup, especially against blue-white auras, where you absolutely have to kill their 2-drops before they start drawing cards and just totally overwhelming you. I think there's a reasonable chance that Monarch Sphere actually could dramatically change the play pattern for Jeskai in a way that ends up giving it a position in the metagame that it didn't previously have. And lastly, we have what probably takes the award for most dreams to memes to maybe actually kind of realistic deck. I thought that I was making a joke when I brewed this up originally. Kami War struck me as a card that actually does pay you off for the amount of mana you spend on it, but I was concerned wouldn't really pay you off for the amount of effort you had to go into fixing your ability to play a 5-color card. Turns out, it's actually more reasonable to cast a 5-mana 6-drop than I was expecting, even in Standard. So the only remaining question really is, does Kami War pay off enough to be worth being a 6-drop? So it's a saga that comes in and exiles any target non-land permanent an opponent controls, which means probably a 4 or a 5-drop, most likely. And then the next turn returns presumably your opponent's biggest thing to their hand, and then they discard a card, which, that's a lot of tempo. Now, probably not worth doing on turn 6, but if you're ramping into it and hitting it on turn 4, or maybe turn 5, then that's a huge amount of tempo, presumably before your opponent's actually getting into a position to kill you. And following that, it flips into a 6/6 Flying Trampler that's still all colors and still isn't legendary, that your opponent has a huge problem attacking through. And when you decide to start attacking with it, your opponent starts returning non-land cards to your hand and pumping Okagachi for every card they return, which means, bare minimum in this deck that doesn't have any 0-drops, it's attacking for 7 every turn, which means it's a 3-turn clock. Which means if you curved Kami War into Kami War, then the first time you attack with this, you're attacking for 7, and the second time you attack, you're attacking with 2 of them that are both doing 7 or more, I guess provided you have cards in your graveyard at all, which shouldn't be too terribly hard. And then you're just killing your opponent on that swing, and if you're not, then you're still getting card advantage off of it. That's pretty powerful. Remains to be seen how the metagame exactly stacks up against it. It's not like Kami War is super good if your opponent's playing a bunch of 1 and 2 drops, but, well, the way that we're ramping into it is either to curve Lotus Cobra into Binding of the Old Gods or Quandrix Cultivator, which, as long as you're making your land drops, results in turn 2 Lotus Cobra, turn 3 Ramp Spell, and then turn 4 you either have the land from Quandrix Cultivator untapping, and your land drop for the turn plus Lotus Cobra's ability gets you to 6 mana. Or if you played Binding of the Old Gods, then the Binding of the Old Gods triggers with Lotus Cobra still in play to put a land into play. And you make your 4th land drop, you get your 4 lands, your land drops Lotus Cobra trigger, and your Binding of the Old Gods Lotus Cobra trigger, and you're there at 6 mana on turn 4. You can also Root Coil Creeper into Quandrix Cultivator to get to turn 4 Kami War. You can't Root Coil Creeper into Binding of the Old Gods Kami War, because at that point you're not getting the extra mana off the Binding of the Old Gods land. Lotus Cobra essentially untapping it, this time around not, but still a lot of different combinations of ways to get to a turn 4 Kami War, and it's not like a turn 5 Kami War is unappealing either. And if you're not ramping into Kami War, or you're not hitting a turn 3 ramp spell, then you can still just play Asika's Chariots into Ren at 7, which is still really strong. Upticking Ren naturally color fixes for Kami War eventually when you're not playing with all of your other color fixers. Binding of the Old Gods and Quandrix Cultivator. Well, Quandrix Cultivator does say basic, but Binding of the Old Gods can go grab any of the Snow Dual lands that are forests, meaning the land that it goes and grabs can fix for whichever color you're missing off of Kami War, probably red or white, because most of the deck is presumably going to be Sultai. Admittedly, haven't figured out the mana base for this yet, and that's going to be a headache, but a regular Sultai mana base isn't terribly hard to build already, and this kind of just goes from there. Maybe you play a number of pathways to try to make it easier to play Kami War. That doesn't play super great with Quandrix Cultivator because it does have to find basics, but rounding all of that out with cheap removal that's actually interactive, and with a deck that presumably between Ren and 7 and Kami War and Chariot has enough pseudo card advantage that it can actually afford to play Fading Hope for tempo without kind of drowning under the card disadvantage that represents. From there, we get to play Commune with Spirits, which digs pretty deep to either find Kami War or Binding of the Old Gods, or just to find lands to fix our colors. You actually end up with a deck that looks a lot more like something with a completely reasonable curve and presumably better mana than I was really expecting when I started this. I think this takes the cake for deck that I'm most excited to see whether it actually works or not when the set releases. That said, it, like most decks, kind of, whether it's good or not is going to depend on what the metagame looks like, and it could be that Esper decks playing a bunch of Disdainful Strokes remain the top deck, or Hinata decks playing a ton of counterspells, in which case this is really not that exciting. Although, if Hinata decks actually do wind up being super common, Binding of the Old Gods and Kami War don't target when you cast them, which means they are actually still on-curve removal spells to Hinata. Who knows? Maybe that ends up being really good. We'll see.